So far in the morning, we kind of heard the historical and policy context, the military and diplomacy. And then we took the story to Albania and Macedonia and the overseas processing. And now we're following the story. So if you can kind of imagine this as the story of Kosovar refugees, now we're taking the Kosovar refugees from Macedonia and Albania to Canada, where they arrived on sustainment sites. So we're following along that trajectory, and I'm really honored to have Gerry Maffre be the moderator. He was a member of the conference organizing committee, and he's been so helpful, and he's also the representative from the Canadian Immigration Historical Society who supported this event.
Thank you, Karnara, and thank you for the welcome. And I must say off the top, it's been a real pleasure working with Karnara these past 3 years. She emailed the Historical Society and said, could you help me connect with a couple of retired immigration officers who were involved in the evacuation? And that blossomed into 20 people, and then more people were referred to her. And then it shifted into preparations for this weekend. So this afternoon, in this first session of the afternoon, our panelists will be commenting from the perspective of their individual experiences and from the perspective of the organizations with whom they worked at the time on the preparations to prepare for the arrivals and the work that went into receiving and welcoming the Kosovar refugee evacuees and helping them during their initial time in Canada when they spent in the sustainment sites. So, Gerry Maffre, I have the honor of chairing this panel, and as Karnara said, I'm a board member of the Canadian Immigration Society, Historical Society, and very happy to be sponsors of this successful event. And if I may, one brief advertisement, there's a newsletter of the Society out on the reception registration table. If you haven't picked it up, you'll therein read how Karnara came to pursue this particular topic. Fascinating story, and I would encourage you to pick it up and take one home if you haven't done so. So our first speaker this afternoon is Valerie Keyes. She worked at National Defense in a fairly key role in the department. Valerie had a military background as well before becoming a civilian, and was deeply involved in the organization of the reception for the Kosovar refugees, as well as other things. Valerie still has her black book of notes from those days, which is quite an achievement. And admittedly, this was not the first time that National Defense had been involved in such an immigration exercise. When Canada decided to take Ugandan Asians who were being expelled from Uganda, how did they get to Canada? They flew on chartered Canadian aircraft and were processed initially and very quickly, admittedly, at the military base in Montreal, Long Point, and then moved on. Likewise, a few years later, when Canada decided to take in Indochina refugees, again, because of the lack of processing in the region, the people were brought either to Canadian Forces Base Griesbach near Edmonton, or again to Long Point for the final processing for their admission to Canada. So there'd been a relationship built through the Immigration and the National Defense Departments in how to respond to these messages. So without further ado, I will invite Valerie to share her experiences.
Thank you, Gerry. Yes, it is true. I do have about 30 of these black books at home. It did take quite a few minutes to go through the stack because, needless to say, they were not in the right order. But it was rather fun going through the notes, and I went through them before Karnara and I met in late September to chat about my experiences and her experiences and comparing notes. It was really interesting to see, one, how bad my handwriting was then, and it's no better now. But it was really interesting to see all the names. And I would refer to different names, and some will come up during the presentation now. I have Gerry M., who coached me for we'd both forgotten this, for a press conference. And then Gerry Van Key, who was the one who got the ball rolling for D&D on the Easter weekend. So there are lots of other ones, other names and so on that will come forward. I should also say that at the time that I was involved with the humanitarian operations, this was actually my secondary duty. My real job was, I was in the Directorate of Peacekeeping Policy, I was responsible for all defense relations with the Middle East. And my predecessor told me humanitarian operations would take approximately 5 minutes a week. Little did he know. When the humanitarian crisis happened, it didn't really come out of the blue, and I was rather fortunate to have been party to a lot of the discussions that had taken place in the previous weeks and months leading up to the humanitarian operation. I had been following all the various UNHCR reports, the messages coming from Madame Ogata, from the OECD, from the IOM, as well as everything coming in from NATO. But I, like most of my contacts at D&D, were taken aback at the speed everything happened at once it all did happen once the thunderbolt hit. But it was certainly, things moved incredibly quickly on the policy side and on the operational side. My first real involvement, like most people, came on Easter Sunday, when I got a call from both my bosses, my director and my director general, as we got back from Easter service. And to be honest, at that moment, I was thinking more of how to get a lamb dinner on the table for 10 than I was thinking about the Balkans. The first of the many meetings I attended over the next 6 weeks or so, convened by CIC, was the next morning on April the 5th, chaired by the Associate Deputy Minister, Michel Doré. I had received a call from Gerry Van Key in my notes, inviting us to the table as a result, I believe, of the discussions that had taken place on the Saturday at the DM level, called together by Foreign Affairs. That meeting was attended by a lot of people. The room, 10 o'clock in the morning on Easter Monday, we were probably 25 people in that meeting, including Health Canada, Foreign Affairs, CEDA, the RCMP, several NGOs, and there were briefings. I don't know whether they were in person or passed on from the IOM and the UNHCR. The planning assumptions made at that meeting were, firstly, up to 5,000 refugees would arrive in Canada starting in 6 days, and the evacuation would take 3 weeks to accomplish. Secondly, the refugees would be housed on Canadian Forces bases and camps from their arrival in Canada for no more than 3 months. Thirdly, the refugees could be expected to arrive at the latest by the 10th of April. We even discussed costs at either that meeting or the next day, and that an estimated cost between 70 and 75 million, which shows how seriously the government was taking this issue. No source of funds was identified, even though we were tossing around numbers. It was made clear that this operation would not interfere with the arrival of refugees from other established channels, such as the family reunification, and the numbers we would be handling were to be kept completely separate. I see in my notes that Rick Herringer regularly briefed us on the numbers coming through these other methods. Rick also reported very early on about what other countries were doing. The US, for example, was going to take in 20,000 Kosovars. The military planning machine leapt into action that afternoon and produced the first plan, but which I understand from my discussions with Crowther and others, never went outside the department. The first plan was presented to the CF commanders on Thursday, the 8th of April, at a meeting chaired by the then Deputy Chief of the Defense Staff, Lieutenant General Ray Hanaud, who a few years later became the CDS. The recommended course of action was to send the refugees en masse to Newfoundland, housing them in tents at the base in Gander until CIC could settle them across the country. Right from the start, it was clear that this plan would not survive, as the instructions that I had repeatedly brought back from the CIC meetings was that the refugees were to be housed mostly in Ontario, preferably close to whatever air base would be activated to receive the flights. At the time, it was still unclear of how the refugees would arrive, whether using Canadian Air Force resources or by chartering commercial aircraft. The assumption was nevertheless made at that point that the Air Force bases would be the sites of arrival, with Trenton in Ontario being the primary focus. The commanders immediately decided against this plan, and a new team was brought in from Kingston to develop a plan more in line with the views of CIC and Foreign Affairs. This team was stood up on the afternoon of the 11th, keeping in mind that the meeting with the commanders had been at 7 o'clock that morning, and was headed by then Commander Harry Harsh. And this time, it wasn't strictly a straight up military team. There was a medical representative and there was a logistics officer. At that same time, we adopted the name Operation Parasol and set aside all the discussions that were going on to call the operation, because the point I made, and I take full credit for this, is that I didn't want to be working with two separate names for the same operation. By now, we understood that the arrival of the refugees was not going to happen as quickly as originally anticipated, which gave us more time to plan properly. The new plan, which Harry and his team produced, called for 2 arrival points: Greenwood in Nova Scotia, Trenton in Ontario. For planning purposes, it was decided 3,000 would arrive through Ontario, the remaining 2,000 going to Nova Scotia. The instruction given was that hard accommodations were to be provided, not tents, which immediately eliminated some of the locations included in earlier draft plans, including Camp Meaford, which had been the #1 choice in the second interim plan. The next step was designating the actual bases. After discussions in Ontario, the main sites were to be Kingston and Borden, as well as the cadet camp at Mountain View. For Nova Scotia, the destinations were to be Halifax and Greenwood, plus Gagetown in Nova Scotia, and Aldershot in Nova Scotia was added during the planning process. I should also mention at this time there was a parallel operation going on apart from everything else, the bombing campaigns and so on. Designated as Op Mikado, their mission was the movement of humanitarian supplies into theater between the 7th and the 14th of April. 500 tons of supplies were to be moved, including prepared food for the World Food Programme. As I was the policy representative, needless to say, on this operation too, I noted that I briefed the CIC daily meetings on Operation Mikado as well. Once the accommodations had been selected, the preparations began in earnest to receive the refugees. Just as the other teams we've heard this morning were preparing the Kosovars on site. By this time, it had been decided to charter aircraft and the arrival sites were being prepared. The Red Cross became heavily involved at this time, and we'll hear from Ish shortly about his perspective. And among the volunteers in Kingston, Mike, you'll be glad to know, were RMC cadets who had finished their exams and were waiting graduation. They were put to work sweeping and building beds. It was good for them. At one point, we entered into a lull in the planning and preparation. For most of us, we were grateful of the break, and therefore were better prepared when on the 29th of April, Rick Herringer warned us the announcement of the arrivals would come that weekend. The first refugees would come on the 3rd. These flights would be a mix of the refugees coming under Op Parasol, but there were probably also going to be some coming under family reunification. Once the flow of refugees began, we at the policy end were able to step back a bit. Although looking through my notes, needless to say, the flow of meetings didn't slow down. We still met daily, 7 days a week, and this was before Zoom, so we really were in person. And we continued to monitor all aspects of the airlifts and arrivals. That continued until the Victoria Day weekend, with the last Op Parasol flight arriving on the 19th of May. Some changes were required as we moved through this, because it was clear, for example, that there were too many refugees for Greenwood to handle, therefore Aldershot became a more important site. In the meantime, Kingston was tasked with dealing with last-minute requests from Quebec to take in some refugees, to facilitate a transfer of people from Kingston to Valcartier, or depending on the timing, directly into the community. We also had the prospect that the numbers overall would increase. And it was not until the middle of May that the decision was made by Monsieur Doré that to hold the line at the 5,000 plus 3,500 coming through other routes. We also had to continue to support ministers and the Prime Minister in their visits to Kingston, Trenton, Halifax, and Borden, as well as the high-level meetings between Minister Axworthy and Madame Ogata, for example, and Ministers Robillard and Marleau meeting with various international organizations. Plus, of course, we had the inevitable G8 meeting and NATO summit meetings for which we had to prepare briefing materials. From the earliest days, we made the assumption that the refugees would remain on the base for no more than 3 months, counting from the middle of April. However, through June, there were indications that they would not be able to move on as quickly as we had anticipated, and this became an issue for us as the bed spaces on the various bases were needed for summer training and cadet camps had to be emptied and prepared by the 1st of July. By June, our operations were slowing down, and we were able to take stock of the lessons learned as well as to deal with other aspects of the operation, including who was going to be paying for it all and who would be the pen on the Treasury Board submission. I was actually asked by Mr. Doré to write the Treasury Board submission, and probably just as well, my bosses turned down that request. Looking at the lessons we learned, it was interesting in and of itself. For one thing, the transition from NATO to a humanitarian operation organization was hugely significant and required a complete change of thought and direction. At D&D, we were fortunate. Gerry's mentioned some of the earlier operations, which were long before my time, but 6 months earlier, I was the point person on the policy side for the first dispatch of the new disaster assistance response team after the hurricanes in Honduras. The lessons we learned from that operation taught us a good deal about working with civilian departments and agencies as well as international organizations. One thing we learned that was for D&D and the forces, 6 weeks was a long operation. For CEDA, 10 years was a long operation. And that highlighted that we spoke different languages. During Parasol, we had to remind ourselves regularly that we at D&D and the CF were operating in support of the lead agency, CIC, not least as we always had the bad habit of thinking we are in charge of any type of this organization. We realized at one point that the media was making that same mistake, and which is why that's perpetuated in some of the news coverage. And it's not helped when Madame Robillard, for reasons I've long since forgotten, decided to run one of her press conferences from the new D&D press center at the basement of 101 Colonel By. Another issue that was raised with me by my military colleagues, it was hard to maintain high-level readiness. And at one point, I had to convince one of my colleagues that this operation was going to happen regardless of the fact that supplies were sitting and doing nothing and could be better used. Overall, it was an extraordinary operation, and we were really proud to be part of it. It was remarkably successful, and the lessons we learned from it were put to good use 2 months later when we had to deploy the DART again, this time to Turkey, and the relationships that we had built continued on through the whole of my tenure and on into my successors. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kanara. Our next speaker is going to be Jim Crowther, who earned the moniker Mayor of Borden at one point. Jim is a retired Foreign Service immigration officer who worked with a wide-ranging team at Sustainment Site Borden. He was the immigration manager in charge, and will speak to us obviously about that time. But Jim, as well as the other immigration officer colleagues of ours who have spoken, all have given to Crownara a strong sense of achievement and personal satisfaction for the roles that they played abroad, at headquarters, and in the domestic field. So, Jim, I will ask you to please come and speak about Camp Borden.
Yes, well, good afternoon. As Gerry said, my name is Jim Crowther. I was the CIC Sustainment Site Manager at Camp Borden. Earlier, Stéphane Leroux dedicated his presentation to a fellow named Ellen Théo, who is no longer with us. And I would like to dedicate my presentation to a lady named Judy McDonald. Judy was the operations manager at Base Borden with me, and was really one of the, and stayed at Borden longer than I did, and was really instrumental in making certain that that the refugees were well cared for, and that the CI staff and CIC staff in particular knew exactly what they had to do. I'm fearful of Gerry's 2-minute, 5-minute, wrap it up sheets over there. I should tell you, one of the young ladies said to me earlier, well, don't worry, as long as you don't get a red slip, you're all right. So someone also asked me, where is Base Borden? And I had assumed that people would know, but for those of you that don't, Base Borden is very close to the city of Barrie. It's about 80 kilometers from Toronto, and Base Borden is the largest military D&D training base in Canada. So things are dropping. In the beginning, as Gerry Van Kessel said earlier, the Prime Minister, I often wondered what the conversation with Bill Clinton was about that led to the decision by Canada to go ahead with the Kosovar evacuation. Nevertheless, all systems were go. On the ground in Borden, there was an exemplary partnership with DND and the Red Cross. I actually went to Base Borden in I think it was March. Forgive me, but it's 25 years ago, and the dates are really not well remembered. And I mention this only because there was some uncertainty that the whole operation was going to take place. So it finally the political decision was made. We were all systems go. We were on the ground, but in fact the CIC component was quite small in Borden. We only had a few officers, and the buses started to arrive. Well, this is where partnership is really important, and the partnership with the Red Cross, the partnership with DND, partnership with the volunteers was essential in receiving the refugees as they came off the bus after having transited many different countries to actually get to Borden, and in settling them in reasonable accommodation in Borden. And this is sort of what it looked like. The bottom right slide, you'll see that the hard accommodation that Valerie talked about is there. I had wanted to include a map of Base Borden, of the area that was given over to us by DND, but I was told it was too small, that no one would be able to read it. Nevertheless, the accommodation was condominium style accommodation, really quite substantial, and there were almost 800 refugees in that accommodation. The photo on the upper left is the building that which was a school building, because Borden is the major training facility for the military in Canada. And they gave us that entire building. So although we used the ground floor as office space later on in the exercise, and because the refugees were at Base Borden for such a lengthy period of time, we actually used some of the upper floors, the upper floor in that building as classroom space. This was the famous T119. My friend Lindy Rodover, who was here and who was the financial controller at Borden at the time, will well remember T119. It was imprinted in our brains, I think. So the buses began arriving, 800 evacuees. They were settling in and recovering. Staff increases were occurring. We didn't have, as I say, we didn't have many immigration people on the ground. Slowly but surely, we added people from Windsor. We added other people from the Ottawa Immigration Center. Red Cross added more people, interpreters, volunteers, and we were finally at the end of, once we were staffed up, we began doing what immigration people normally do, and that is interviewing people to determine whether, well, not to determine, but to obtain sort of bare bones information on them and their families, and to appropriately document them. So this is part of the support sustainment team, and you'll see that, and this in fact is not all of us. I don't know how many people are in that picture, but there are probably 70 or 80, many other people, Red Cross people, some CIC people, certainly DND people. You can see the DND presence was fairly substantial. They're all along the back row of that particular image. Community support and interest. I decided to include this slide because it says to me that, well, that, you know, every bike, I suspect, was one family. It was a donation by one family. So it shows you the very substantial interest that Canadians were taking in the welfare of the Kosovar refugees. Close at the top of this slide. Donna Chanda, who was the Red Cross lead at Base Borden, came to me one day and she said, "I want to show you something." So she took me off to a local arena, and of course this is April, May, I guess. The ice has just come off out of the arena. I went into the arena and there were piles and there were clothes that were piled almost to the rafters. Without a word of a lie, there were 20-foot, 30-foot piles of clothes that had been donated by Canadians, but she was telling me that apparently people from across the United States and Canada were donating clothes for the Kosovar refugees as well. And in fact, she took me around the corner and they had another 5 or 6, the infamous sheet of paper. They had another 5 or 6 trailer loads of clothes that had been donated. I don't know what happened to all of those in the end. Challenges, health and dental care. We had a medical clinic that was initially staffed by D&D medical personnel. We eventually had to bring on our own doctors, very substantial amounts of money. The medical clinic was used by very many people on a daily basis. Dental care, I mentioned dental care because there was a pediatric dental problem amongst the youngsters at the base, and so we sent a very large group of them off to see dentists, and we came back with information that it was going to cost something like $55,000 to, this is 25 years ago, $55,000 to fix the teeth of all of these youngsters. Military police interactions, there were threats. We were fairly close to Toronto. There was information that was provided by local police agencies to the military police that there were undesirable people in the area and that they might be trying to get onto the base. So we were certainly on our guard for that. The evacuees were, of course, initially unable to leave the base, and so there was certainly a great deal of boredom on their part. And even at this stage, there were evacuees. Gerry Van Kessel talked about the hunger striker, but we certainly had people that walked into our office and said, I think I've made the wrong choice. I want to go back to Kosovo. And this is, of course, just a few weeks after they'd arrived in Canada. It was a very difficult situation to deal with. Dollars, food services, medical care. Lindy, it was really, as Gerry Van Kessel had said, $150 million. It was a budget, was not to be spared exercise. Lindy Rudover will tell you that she presented me with lots of really big checks, including one for food services that was something in the order of $400,000. And I said to her, Lindy, can I really sign a check for $400,000? And she said, Jim, you can do anything you want. So it was quite a surprise. Community support and interest. We set up a mosque because there was the Albanian community in the Toronto area. Priests had come up, and there was some interest on the part of the community at Base Borden in having a mosque. So we set that up. Again, there was a cost associated with that, but it was money was not to be spared exercise. We had Ty Domi's mother visit. We had Ty Domi's brother visit. There was some suggestion that Frank Mahovlich was going to visit, which always amused me because he's not even Albanian. He's of Croatian extraction, if anything. So, media interviews. I met with local print media many times. There were interviews with the CBC. There was a huge amount of community interest in what was happening with the Kosovar refugees. The Ontario Chiefs of Police were meeting in a local hotel at the time that I was at Borden, and I was asked to go and speak to them, which I did. And I made a very general presentation. And one of the questions that they asked me was whether or not the Kosovar refugees were going to be fingerprinted. And I suppose this is a natural enough question from a group of police officers. You know, how are you going to identify these people in the future? And I said, well, this was a humanitarian exercise, and that they were not going to be fingerprinted. I also made a presentation to the Vietnamese Canadian Association. The president of the association had come to Base Borden and said that they wanted to give back in some way for the support that they had received from Canadians two decades before this. And so they had a gala in Toronto in support of the Kosovars, which I thought was really an admirable activity. The ever-famous Chrétien visit. Everyone seems to know about this and seems to want to ask questions. I was there when he fell on the basketball court, but I must tell you that he's really quite an incredible basketball player. He's really a very good basketball player. Unfortunately, he was wearing his street shoes that day, so it didn't really work out too well for him. We also had a visit by Madame Robillard, the immigration minister. So there was certainly a whole of government interest in what was happening with the Kosovar refugees. Resettlement. We had the Thunder Bay Economic Community Association come to Base Borden to speak to refugees, to let them know that there were jobs and accommodation available for them in Thunder Bay. For most of them, this was a very difficult decision to make. It would have been remote from any of their community contacts that would have been available to them. And certainly within the immigration department, the settlement group, accommodation is always a problem in Toronto. People wanted to settle in Toronto, but the settlement folks were saying, really, there just isn't available accommodation for them. And eventually there was, people did move to communities. I had left Base Borden by then. People moved on to communities, and of course their repatriation did occur. The one thing I would say in terms of lessons learned is that we probably kept the Kosovar refugees at base Borden and probably the other bases as well for too long a period of time. I think it would have been, as other people have said, it's more traditional to move refugees into communities very, very quickly. And I think that would have aided them in their resettlement and integration into life in Canada. I mentioned the Prime Minister. Yes, there was high-level political support that really made this whole exercise the great success that it was. And you've already seen some of the imagery about the support that was provided by by communities across Canada. And I think that's it for me. Thank you.
I now call on Ismael Aquino. My pleasure in meeting him for the first time as we started to prepare for this afternoon's seminar. Ish was back then the manager in Nova Scotia for the Red Cross. And the Red Cross was, as we've said many times through this day, critical to the success of the movement in organizing, providing support in the field at the sustainment sites. And Ismael was central to that in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick at the sustainment camps there. So Ish, I will ask you to now address the delegates.
25 years. I used to have a lot more hair and no kids. Gerry, Jim, Valerie, Laura, Quinara, distinguished guests and refugees from 25 years ago. Meredita Sipokoloni. Good afternoon. Translation services and volunteers played a vital role at the time. I am honored and thankful to be here with you all today, especially after serving a long career with Canadian Red Cross. I also stand here with a pin on my lapel, the Operation Parasol pin. It was designed by a Red Cross volunteer and retired military personnel from CFB Greenwood, Richard Harvey. All those who served were very proud to wear this pin. And I just want to ask, is there any Red Cross volunteers in the room? We've got a couple. Okay, I just want to say thank you, for your time that you give. The arrival of Kosovar refugees to Canada was without a doubt one of the most memorable events of my career. For the Canadian Red Cross in Nova Scotia, it was an unbelievable 6 months, if not 12 months, disaster response humanitarian efforts leading up to the arrival of refugees. The Operation Parasol came at the heels of the crash of Swissair 111, Operation Persistence, off the coast of Nova Scotia, losing all 229 souls who were on board. And Peggy's Cove became a different, changed for me, became a new symbol. And the Sunrise Manor fire evacuation of over 150 seniors, which two died, happened on New Year's Eve. And I have to say that Red Cross staff and volunteers were already tired and exhausted. Is there anyone here under the age of 25? We've got a few. I just want to give you a special thank you for being here. At the time, I was a very young manager, just became a new manager. I took on a new department. It was after the blood crisis. We were in bankruptcy protection at the time. And I also had a supervisor at the time whose mother was dying, and he had to leave. And he said, "Okay, I'm going to go back to Newfoundland, and you're going to be the acting regional director for Nova Scotia. You're going to be the acting Atlantic director for international services. And by the way, we're expecting 5,000 refugees into Canada, and we need to be on a 72-hour readiness." So I have to say the ice and the icing on the cake, and for me personally, was that my beautiful wife, who's with me today, was 24 and pregnant with our first. She was an active Red Cross volunteer during Swissair. She was a pediatric nurse at the IWK, and she had been my pillar for that period of time with all the things that were happening. And you can see over here, the picture, you can see Major Bungie from Salvation Army off to the side there, and Colonel Hanley over here. And then you can see the planes with the arrival of the refugees. That was a pivotal time, and it's something I'll never forget. During Operation Parasol, Tanya remained at home during the last trimester of her pregnancy, and I traveled everywhere. To say it was a stressful time is an understatement. The entire year was a blur for me. And unfortunately, I didn't have access to my notes. All I had was 2 pieces of paper that I saved. These are 25 years old. Okay, so this was the plan that we were given. And it was a wonderful plan because it was very simplistic and very simple to follow in terms of what was to happen, you know. I just recognized that, the fact that the Red Cross had a role internationally. We were there. And then we would have a role at CFB Greenwood to be the first, for refugees to arrive. And then we were then to set up sustainment sites in Camp Aldershot, and CFB Gagetown and CFB Halifax, and eventually Greenwood would become another sustainment site. So I'm going to speak to you a little bit about the Atlantic perspective and share volunteer stories and some of my memories. So here's another piece of paper, 25 years old. My notes were pretty rough, and I was working very closely with Citizenship and Immigration to sort of determine where we need to put Red Cross volunteers, okay? And where do we put interpreters, and so on, and where we would have CSC representatives. It was very rough, and that was sort of like wishful thinking at the time, because as I mentioned, interpretation services was very challenging, and at that time it was crucial, particularly for the medical personnel. So this was known as the Medical Mall, and it was a bit of makeshift. And I got to say the Canadian forces were incredible in terms of putting up walls for flow and to make things happen. And Airbus's flights of refugee passengers would arrive every 48 hours with teams of volunteers and translators. We assisted with the reception, and I still remember trying to create translations, creating signs with translation on it, like to try to anticipate all the things because of the lack of interpreters, and to help with medical processing. And each family was led through the medical mall by a Red Cross volunteer and interpreter. One of the first steps was the Zeddy Bear, giving out the Zeddy Bear, and going through the shoe store and replacing all of the shoes, and to replace them so they would be deemed agricultural, because they were deemed agriculturally unsound. And this here sort of illustrates sort of the logistical challenges we had. Our emergency operations center was in Halifax, and we were fortunate to have a retired military person who specialized in logistics. But the rival was in CFB Greenwood. And then we had to move groups to Gagetown and Aldershot and into Halifax. So it created some logistical challenges for us. The other piece that we did was to receive donations from the public and from corporations. And that in itself was a bit of a challenge. So we did send groups throughout. And one of the things that I found challenging was that we had 1 month to prepare. So I just want to talk a little bit about the Red Cross here. At that time, there was a new mission of the Canadian Red Cross, and I have it memorized. It was to improve the lives of the most vulnerable by mobilizing the power of humanity in Canada and around the world. It has recently since changed, but that was really important in terms of motivating us. And we also, like I said, we also played an important role overseas because that was a reflection of the same mission. And we work very closely alongside with our partners in CIC and Canadian Forces. And the Red Cross logo itself provided a familiar face to the refugee community. And I also have to mention that the fundamental principles of the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement was important, in providing a degree of cultural sensitivity, humanity, impartiality, neutrality, independence, voluntary service, unity, universality. And these fundamental principles sum up the movement's ethics and are at the core of its approach to helping people in need during armed conflict, disaster, natural disasters, and other emergencies. And overall, the Red Cross aims to protect human life, health, while ensuring respect for all peoples and to prevent and alleviate all forms of suffering. So as I read through my old notes about Operation Parasol, I recall our Red Cross activities. I worked very closely with my supervisor and mentor at the time, John Byrne. And sometimes I found I spent more time with him than with my wife during the stretch of that time. As for Operation Parasol, John was responsible for the refugee arrival, while I was responsible for the operations of the 3 sustainment sites in Nova Scotia. But each day, the two of us worked hand in glove throughout the 4 months. And my wife and I, as healthcare professionals, also understood the importance and need to help the community for physical health, mental health, and spiritual health, and especially for those who've been affected by trauma. From what I recall, the Canadian Red Cross was invited by CIC to specifically provide the humanitarian touch, helping meet the basic needs of the refugees, relied heavily on volunteers from the community and interpreter volunteers that came as far as British Columbia, and coordinated the contribution of NGO partners. In Nova Scotia, the Red Cross coordinated the efforts of thousands of volunteers. We managed incredibly generous donations from the community, at times quite overwhelming, as we saw pallets upon pallets of goods arrive. The Red Cross volunteers provided humanitarian assistance throughout the operation from the moment the refugees stepped off the plane to accompany them to buses to the sustainment sites. Red Cross volunteers also worked as liaison with the medical clinics in the different communities in coordinating transportation. I also remember the incredible collaborative effort and camaraderie we experienced. My thoughts of working so closely with the likes of Ron Heisler and Tony Marshall and the CIC team will never be forgotten. And I'll never forget the name of Bruna Cara Christie, which is also with CIC. The collaboration will be etched in our minds. Relationships will become lifelong. We will never forget our work together. Colonel Hanley and members of the Canadian Forces at Greenwood, Aldershot, and Windsor Park, Major Bungay of Salvation Army, and the province's health and community services, the Red Cross staff, and the thousands of volunteers who work day in and night. And the Red Cross provided social activities and play areas for the children. We also helped set up advisory committees, which included elders from the community and met regularly to assess the community needs. In some cases, we had mayors of the community. In Halifax, Red Cross treated a group of refugees to some maritime hospitality by organizing sailing trips on the famed Blue Nose 2. There was a teen named Arbor Rexhepi who enjoyed that sail. They sang the Rankin family song, We Rise Again. At CFB Gagetown, a concert organized by Red Cross saw more than 95% of the refugee community singing and dancing. By coincidence, the concert fell on the same day that the peace agreement was announced. At CFB Aldershot, Kosovar mothers and daughters attended quilting classes organized by Red Cross and have completed many quilts, and one of the quilts combined various fabrics to make a Canadian flag, valley apples, and a pattern of Nova Scotia tartan. One challenge was to train and manage the volunteers from the community and coordinate NGO contributions. I got to wrap it up now. In Nova Scotia alone, the Red Cross coordinated the efforts of 1,000 volunteers, matching volunteers to a variety of activities. And it was important to instill the mission with the volunteers. A Red Cross volunteer at CFB Greenwood recalled, "I remember watching the plane land, feeling full of emotion, these people stepping foot on Canadian soil for the first time, I started to try and imagine how they must be feeling. A family came through. There were 3 children. The youngest was a little boy, blonde hair, cute, chubby face. He comes sauntering through, clutching the Zeddy bear and his little Canadian flag, wearing the new sneakers. He stopped in front of me and starts lifting his feet and doing this little dance, and with a great big smile on his face the whole time. My heart just filled with such warmth, and all I could think of was what a beautiful child, and wishing with all my heart that he would always be happy and happy in his place in New World as he was with those sneakers. The Red Cross volunteers provided humanitarian assistance to the refugees from the first time they arrived, when they got off the plane. And at the time, my wife was a pediatric nurse at the IWK Health Center, in which refugee children had medical appointments and even admitted to their unit. Today, she's with the Dalhousie University School of Dentistry. At the time, managed 90% of the dental cases. So I need to fly through this a little bit, but I just wanted to let you know that in 2007, Ruth Goldblum, who was the co-founder of Pier 21, Canadian Museum of Immigration, encouraged me to do to complete an oral history as the lead of the Red Cross. And at that time, it really gave me sort of an appreciation for what the immigration experience is. And at the time, in 2012, after I had an interview about the deployment of volunteers to Hurricane Sandy in 2012, Artha Rexhepi, a student of broadcast journalism, used her journalistic drive to track me down through the Twitterverse to secure an interview for her assignment. And later, when she asked for my bio, I came to realize that she was one of the young Kosovar refugees who arrived 14 years earlier at the age of 13. And in a sense, the Twitterverse helped us reconnect. And I also get to know her father, Zach Rexhepi, who was an incredibly talented artist. We hit it off. He painted a Red Cross. He did a Red Cross painting for us for our 100th anniversary. He did something for the Epilepsy Association Gala. And then also from Arta, she shared a number of news stories. I know I need to tie this up. I should mention, yeah, so one of the things that I had, what happened with Arta is that she asked to become a Red Cross volunteer in order to give back. And speaking of children, this is Lear, the first Kosovar refugee born in Canada from Aldershot. I never had the privilege to meet the new family, and I hope they are doing well. One of the quotes of Arta's story is that I read is that life is good. I believe that what we live for, to serve, to help, to make life good, to serve, to help make life good for others. Laura mentioned that last night, which was an incredibly moving night, about the Zeddy bears. They are no longer available, but it is a symbol of a period of time. The Zeddy bear had become a powerful image to me and many others, and the Zeddy bear was intended for house fire victims, specifically for children. But for Swisher 111, it became comfort for the grieving, and adults clung to the bear. And it elicited a certain emotion response to me. For the Operation Parasol, it was joy. It makes me happy, and at the 25th anniversary at Pier 21, Zeddy was a celebrity. So many pictures were taken at that time, and last night was no exception. I noticed so many people doing that. And Swisher not only gave a gift to Operation Parasol with the Zeddy bear, but also the fact that it put an infrastructure of volunteers that were ready to respond to this one. And also the fact that because of Swisher, there was already a psychosocial and mental health network and steering committee that was already established that was easy to ramp up. And both Swisher and Operation Parasol precipitated the first agreement between the Red Cross and a provincial government, which is today is in every province in Canada. So when I think of my career, much has happened. 25 years can sometimes seem like a long time. When I look at my own kids, 4 of them now, 25 years goes by. in a blink. Our first, Nicholas, recently turned 25. And I will never forget the fact that he was born at the conclusion of Operation Parasol. Finally, when I look back, I can't help but say it has been an honor to serve alongside many of you. I'm truly grateful. And to the Kosovar refugees who arrived 25 years ago, welcome once again. I would like to end with a message from a former Red Cross volunteer who served during our Operation Parasol, Nicole Wood. And she says, I would love to just pass on that it was a privilege to be part of your lives, and I'm grateful for the opportunity. Truly, your strategy and strength throughout was a life lesson I'll never forget, and I sincerely cherish every memory and every friendship. I wish you all well. Thank you.
Ismael, thank you very much for a very personal reflection on your experience. Probably reflects a lot of what the folks who went through it did experience. And it was interesting that you wrapped up with that picture of the first baby born in Canada, because one of my colleagues, Pierre Lamy, was the communications guy that we sent from the immigration headquarters to Gagetown. And he had the pleasure of phoning me one morning to say, Gerry, guess what? I was also, as the Director General of Communications at Immigration Headquarters, one of those people who got a fateful call on Easter Sunday morning to say, you better get ready. And it was an experience I'll not soon forget, those 25 years ago. Anyhow, I will open the floor to questions, the microphones, if you wouldn't mind standing and identifying yourself. And if you want to speak to a specific panelist, please do so.
Yep. Okay. Hi, Marilyn Cooper again. I spoke this morning about us putting an orange or red status on people before they left the camps and on the planes. What I forgot to mention was that we actually had people wearing red tags or orange tags around their necks or pinned to their clothing for faster identification when they arrived at the bases. Can either you, they're both looking like, really? What? Can either of you comment, you gentlemen who are at the recent, know anything about whether it went well, whether it was noticed or noted or just totally missed?
Conara, without putting you on the spot, do you recall whether the family archive has one?
Absolutely. Lindy Rudolph, sidekick to Jim. And yes, it was very, very helpful. It helped fast track with the medical streaming of the various refugees who arrived, because we, as you realize, we did back end, not front end medical, and it was very helpful. Thank you. Yes, Jim, it did happen. He was busy. Busy guy.
Anyone else have a question? Let me throw one to the panel then. You've talked about the community support, and you've also talked about the youngsters. Would you care to comment a little bit more on the level of community support? And would you care to comment on what you had to do at the sustainment sites to deal with the elders, the middle-aged, and the kids and teenagers especially?
Well, certainly at base Borden, once we gave the kids bicycles, it became a bit of an issue, because Borden is an open base. Lindy's not looking at me now. I do recall that we had the military police come to us. I'm sorry, this is a memory from 25 years ago, but we had the military police come to us one day and tell us that we should put a notice up for all of the refugees that they should not ride their bikes over to the schools and look through the window of the into the classrooms, and that it was disturbing the classes at the local school on the base.
When I look back, each of the bases were different in terms of you had Camp Aldershot, which was very much self-contained, and then you had Windsor Park, which is again a fairly open base where people would go. And then we had Greenwood. So there was a variation in terms of issues that would arise. But yeah, I would say very similar, like, things like you should wear a helmet when you bike. So there's a bit we had some safety concerns. The other thing I want to point out was the smoking was an issue. So again, recognizing cultural and being culturally sensitive, but then you're also on somebody else's home, which was Canadian Forces. So there's certain rules that so there was a bit of a struggle around that. And I think that's why the advisory committees and having sort of a mayor, for example, in that daily communication between the community and the partners was really, really important. So that helped a lot and helped alleviate with some of the issues.
Thank you.
It's not a question, it's a response. There was an education we should have given too. One with the telephone. So we gave access to telephones, and when everyone here's used that push button. Do you know what a push button phone is? Just in those days, when they press 0 for an outside line, it automatically went to Red Cross. It went to the fire department and went to the police, and they were trying to do long distance back home. That was one. Another education we should have done was animals. Has anyone ever heard of a skunk? So do you remember the one night? No, you were busy. So everyone at 9 at night left the beautiful building that Jim showed you. Every refugee was outside. It was my first night in 2 weeks that I was able to go to the hotel to sleep. At 9 at night, I get a phone call. Lindy, every refugee is out of their building. I said, okay, night. They said, no, you don't understand. So I said goodbye to my bed. I made an appearance. This little boy had picked up a skunk, didn't know what it was, brought it inside his little room. It's an easy way to evacuate the place.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Tony Batista. I was one of the senior officers at Borden during that time. Question for Val and Jim. One of the things that came to us even before the refugees arrived was how do we handle a situation where people are coming from a war-torn country into a military base and, seeing officers and military and equipment and people around them, and how would that affect them? My response at the time was, well, we'll see when they get here, and we'll try to treat them as humanly as possible. But many of them actually made the comment that they had never seen that side of the military, that humanitarian aspect. I just wondered what kind of reaction you got.
No, I think that's true. I think we needed to sensitize the refugees to the support that was available from the military, as well as the volunteers, the Red Cross, and other people. I really don't remember how we do. I remember individual conversations, but I don't remember whether or not there was a notice put out that that military personnel, people in uniforms, were there to help. But I think they certainly understood that fairly early on, that that military officers were there to help, along with the other people as well.
In my notes, I have reference in one of the many meetings at CIC was, should military personnel not wear their uniforms? And I said that would be wrong, because we've got to educate them in this fashion, that the military is there to help, not to hurt. And that idea was quickly squashed, and that the military personnel were going to wear their uniforms regardless. We did run into an issue in Kingston, is the Victoria Day weekend is the RMC graduation weekend. On traditionally on the Friday night, there's a tattoo with fireworks. And I realized this partway through a meeting on the Friday afternoon, and leapt to my feet, left my co-chair in charge, and went and made one phone call. And that was to the Red Cross coordinator at the base, who managed to get an army of people up to the camp in case there were going to be problems. Needless to say, the kids loved the fireworks. They thought they were splendid. And I've always thought that it may have been one of the turning points for a lot of the kids, for the families, that the military was there to help them. And that made a big difference.
If I could just comment, Gerry, like, I do recall, some of the preparation around the military uniform, but I think one of the things was the fact there was partnership, that you would see the Red Cross next to the military, next to CIC. That in itself showed that we were here to help.
So that would be, we understood it's a friendly military. It's not, you came to a friendly country. So we didn't, and I didn't see much uniformed in Borden camp. Maybe now and then. And another problem with children was they take their bags to fix to firefighters.
What I
So
think
that's
some of the first contacts that the refugees had at Base Borden would have been with military personnel that were in the clinic, in the medical clinic. So in fact, they were there to help, and they saw that. And I think they took from that all of the military people were there to support them.
And I think somebody told us that right away. If we come, maybe at the restaurant or somewhere, told us that military is friendly here. Don't worry. So that's okay. I thank you for your volunteering.
Hello, my name is Megan. You've talked a lot about the partnership between the DND, the Red Cross, and the CIC. I was wondering if you could speak to the partnership with the folks living in Borden, which this is now their home, and how you worked with the community living there. And if anybody in the audience wanted to share, I don't want to put anybody on the spot. I believe there are people in the audience who lived at Camp Borden, and to talk about how you blended, considering the logistics, but also how you made it a home for people.
Well, I think that very large numbers of the volunteers were from within the region, but I don't know that for a fact. Certainly, I can remember Julie. I mean, one of many people, but a key person that worked in the CIC office who lived in Barrie, as I recall. So I think very large numbers of the volunteers that were working at Base Borden actually lived in the area. But we were run off our feet during the day, so I didn't always have a chance to talk to individual volunteers, except the people that actually worked in the office with us. But my sense was that very large numbers of people were from the region. I don't know if that was the case in other places.
Sorry, I was just going to say my family lived in Borden. I lived on the base, and two of the things, amongst many other things that we did for the refugee community, was to, first of all, involve the younger people in some of our sport activities, some of our social activities. And we also invited them to actually visit some of the various schools that were on the base, and that helped. And in fact, the dependents, I hate that word, but the family members were actually incredible, essential volunteers to actually help the families, the refugees themselves, to actually not only attend those activities, but also help them with anything that they needed, including toys and some clothes as well.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Okay. Okay, well, all right. One last quick question, please, Jan. And
Jan Raska, Canadian Museum of Immigration. A reflective question for the panel. So Canadians are fairly used to seeing immigrants and refugees come off ships, come off airplanes across the land border. And oftentimes, we can't necessarily predict what the headlines or what the reporting will be like, how politicized it will be. We're sort of coming into an age where perhaps our appetite for immigration is decreasing when unemployment goes up, inflation goes up, or when all those things go down, our appetite for immigration goes up. My question for the panel would be, what is the one thing you would want the Canadian public to know about the Kosovar movement or any refugee for that matter? Thank you.
Let me start. You can collect your thoughts too.
Go ahead, Gerry.
You remind me, Jan, of a different time. I wasn't directly involved. I was on a tough posting in Paris at the point, France, not Paris, Ontario, which would have been fine. But the situation in South Vietnam, in South Asia, was going down the tubes, and there was talk of bringing refugees from Southeast Asia. And then there was the Hai Hong incident. And suddenly the public attitude shifted because here was a graphic example of what's going on in the world in an area that we know generally do little about in the time other than the fighting. And the attitudes changed and Canadians started to line up to sponsor. So those sorts of things can change. It would be interesting. And I have no wisdom in what's going to happen next week when there's an outbreak that's mediatized. And maybe it has connections to Canadians anyways through human family relationships and ties, or has no connection, as was the case in Southeast Asia. So whether that sort of an incident would shift public attitude as it is right now, seemingly for any number of reasons that are advanced as to why, we need to better manage this immigration program, which we try and do. We all try to do in our careers. So that attitude can change on a dime, I think, and it's unpredictable, and you don't know what's going to do it. Everybody was worried about Middle Easterners, and suddenly that poor little boy washed up on the shores of Lebanon, and kaboom, the Prime Minister's commitment to 25,000 initially was, yes, let's do it.
I would just say that I reflected a little bit on this, but the human dimension was very important during this exercise. It was I saw it on the faces of the officers that were working with me at Base Borden. There was happiness, joy in being able to support these people that had suffered so much. Similarly, there was great, all of that support that we've talked about in the community. So it was a positive on many, many levels. It's positive for the officers, positive for the Red Cross, positive for the communities. I know Gerry Van Kessel talked about the negatives that came soon after that, but at the time it was nothing but positives about the movement.
I just want to mention, when I go back 25 years ago, that one of the pieces was around, contracting diseases from the refugee community. That was one of the things. And one of the things that we did at the Red Cross is we ensured there was a media relations person for every site. And it was important to share the stories, the soccer games with other members of the community. It's to give them a human face because they were on Canadian Forces bases, which means they weren't out in the public. They were in these locations, so there wasn't much exposure. So the only way to expose it was through press and hopefully through TV, so that the public could see, this is a wonderful community, and we're all working with the community.
And I think one of the reasons why it was so positive at the time was that there'd been a lot of media coverage there'd been some media coverage of what was happening in the Balkans and what had happened in the Balkans with the Canadian forces having been there for, better part of a decade by the time the Kosovo crisis hit. And it was also a self-contained number. It was defined in advance, and it was fast. It was incredibly fast. And to be able to mount that type of operation again would take the organization, the considerable organization, and the effort that we all and everybody who was involved in it, in the collaborative effort to carry it forward. And I think that point is one that, with the current issues, and Mr. Axworthy hit on them last night, is that the constant arrival of immigrants as opposed to a package.
Okay, that'll bring the end of our panel discussion this afternoon for this topic, a very human presentation, and I thank the three of you for giving it that real people touch. Thank you.
Every time we finish a panel, I'm like, okay, now we have to thank the immigration officials, Red Cross and D&D, who really did spend countless hours and overtime. I think it was Mr. Crowther who showed me when I went to your house to interview you, you were like, look at my overtime sheets from 25 years ago. And I thought, I can't think of a job in the world I would put those hours in for, but maybe for Kosovar refugees, I would.
What I didn't include in my presentation was a picture of Crowther as a 3-year-old. I'd wanted,
Oh, sorry.
no, I'd wanted to include it because I thought it would be amusing to Crowther and the rest of the audience, but I was told I only had 10 minutes.
Yeah, it's becoming increasingly hard for me not to participate, especially because we were on base Borden and my mom participated.